Hello fellow collectors, I hope you're doing very well. Today I continue my series where I talk about the best films I watched in the preceding month. For me, April was an incredible month of watching a lot of amazing films, so do expect there to be more than a usual amount of honourable mentions at the end. In particular for me, April was a month dominated by watching two big trilogies, which we'll get into a bit later. And as such, I wanted to talk about all 6 films, at least briefly, so this is a bit of a longer video than usual. And because of that, I have actually put timestamps in the description below, so you're welcome to jump around if you'd like to. And so, without further ado, let's talk about the best films I watched in April. First up is Croupier, a film from 1998 directed by Mike Hodges and starring Clive Owen, Alex Kingston and Gina McKee. Last year I decided it would be fun to do what many others have done and make a video on films that I would love to see get a boutique release. And at the top of my list was Croupier, which I had previously watched I think on the BFI streaming service. Shortly after I'd started scripting that video, about 2 weeks later, lo and behold Arrow announced that they would be releasing a 4K version of it. Not necessarily the boutique distributor that I was expecting, but I was absolutely delighted to hear it. Croupier is an excellent neo-noir, where a young Clive Owen portrays a struggling writer who gets a job in a local casino as, you might imagine, a croupier. As he works, he starts to find his inspiration, and he starts to write. The story takes some really interesting twists and turns as he starts to become addicted himself, not to the gambling, but as he says, to watching people lose. Then with the arrival of our femme fatale figure, things really kick off and Owen's character almost takes on a Bukowski-like persona in some ways. It's a very British noir which is full of intrigue and dark excitement, and definitely until now at least, I think an underappreciated gem. Next is the legendary Casablanca, a film from 1942 directed by Michael Curtiz and starring Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman, Paul Heinried, Claude Rains, Dooley Wilson and of course Peter Lorre. I finally got around to watching the new 4K release of it that was released last year, and my goodness, it was phenomenal to revisit this film. I've only previously seen a DVD of it, but I did think the 4K was stunning. This film feels like it must have been one of those rare occasions where every person involved was at the top of their game and together created something spectacular. Though I did recently watch an interview with Ingrid Bergman who said that people were very much flying by the seat of their pants and they didn't know what was happening from day to day almost. Regardless though, on screen there is nothing but brilliance. The performances all round were stellar. I particularly like Claude Rains in this as he is so politely corrupt, but Bogey and Bergman's sizzling chemistry really binds the story together. A jaded bar owner in Casablanca somehow running into his lost love. Of all the gin joints in all the towns in all the world, she walks into mine. Thrown together again in the midst of global war, German occupation, local corruption and the possibility of helping the resistance. It's a thoroughly compelling and moving story with some of the greatest actors of all time at the peak of their powers. I also think there's so much poignancy that we miss watching it these days, as the film was released in 1942, right in the middle of the war, when no one knew what the outcome would yet be, which for me adds to the importance of it massively. And I'll end by simply saying that out of the 400-ish films I currently have on my Letterboxd, this is only the second film I've given 5 stars to. It is simply incredible and a true classic. Then we have Drive. I've got here the massive 4K edition from Second Sight, which I finally cracked open in April, after it being sat on my shelf for nearly a year at that point. It's a film from 2011 directed by Nicholas Winding Refn and starring Ryan Gosling and Carey Mulligan, along with a host of other great supporting actors like Bryan Cranston, Christina Hendricks and Oscar Isaac. I remember seeing this back in 2011 when it came out, and I remember loving it at the time, but I haven't actually revisited it since then until now. And my goodness, I was not disappointed. It lived up to my memories and more, though I will say right off the bat that I remember vividly how violent it was, and it was a bit too much for me back then, and honestly still a bit too much for me now. But really, that's more or less the only negative I have to say about it. It's steady without being slow, quiet without being empty. It has this almost inexorable pull towards a conclusion that starts from the very first scene. It quietly builds the tension, almost in the background, until it becomes very much in the foreground, and then, to use a terribly cheesy line, it goes from 0 to 60 very fast indeed. Featuring a perfectly subdued performance from Ryan Gosling, it's a simple enough story but so incredibly engaging and shot so beautifully. This one was a real delight to revisit. And then onto the first of the two trilogies that more or less dominated my viewing experience for April, and it's Taylor Sheridan's Frontier trilogy that he wrote, which consists of Sicario from 2015, directed by Denis Villeneuve, Hell or High Water from 2016, directed by David Mackenzie, and Wind River from 2017, which Taylor Sheridan himself directed. Again, it's been a good long while since I last saw these, and in the meantime I've set about getting some stunning editions for them. Here, both Sicario and Wind River are both from Film Arena, and as the only premium release that I know of for Hell or High Water was from Kimchi DVD, is long out of print and going for crazy money, I was very happy to import this Lionsgate release of Hell or High Water in 4K from the US, which actually still has no 4K release in the UK as far as I know, so that was money very well spent. I'm a big fan of more loose trilogies like this one, as the films are all standalone. I would say it's a more thematic trilogy, and of course they all deal with life on the outskirts, the frontiers, where there's less help, less manpower, perhaps less law, maybe places that are less cared about. First is Sicario, which stars Emily Blunt with an incredible performance, as well as Daniel Kaluuya, Benicio del Toro and Josh Brolin. This is a tough, unflinching thriller that for me actually, possibly to its detriment, I think keeps you in the dark just a bit too long, but that does certainly mirror Emily Blunt's character's experience. It tells the story of an FBI agent who's been working to combat the drugs trade, and she gets involved with a special ops team supposedly to make a real difference. But the question is, does she? It's a film that blurs the lines between good and evil incredibly well. It's brutal, tough, impactful, gritty, and just expertly directed by Denis Villeneuve. Then I think we have arguably my favourite of the three films, Hell or High Water. This is one that I absolutely loved when I first saw it, and there's a quote that has stayed with me ever since about poverty being like a disease, so get ready for my terrible American accent. I've been poor my whole life. Like my parents, their parents before them. It's like a disease passing from generation to generation, becomes a sickness. That's what it is. Affects every person you know. If you'll excuse the terrible accent, then it is such a powerful and resonant statement, and as I say, it's not something that I've ever forgotten. This one is a story about two brothers, played by Chris Pine and Ben Foster, who go on a carefully planned, for the most part, bank robbing spree across small towns in Texas, and about the two rangers played by Jeff Bridges and Gil Birmingham, who are trying to catch them. It's a film about justice, crime, and the bonds of family. Chris Pine and Ben Foster are absolutely electric together, and Ben Foster is definitely an actor that I don't think gets enough notoriety, because I think he's fantastic. And if you haven't seen Leave No Trace, you absolutely should, which stars him and a young Thomasin McKenzie. Hell or High Water is also gorgeously shot, with cinematography done by Giles Nugents. I think it gives you a real sense of openness and freedom, which is really what our two brothers are after. It is so difficult to pick a favourite out of these three, but I do think possibly this one just might clinch it for me. And then lastly we have Wind River, where finally we get Taylor Sheridan both writing and directing. Both of our leads, played by Jeremy Renner and Elizabeth Olsen, give absolutely brilliant performances here, and I think this is really the sort of role where Renner thrives. I guess it's a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I actually thoroughly enjoyed The Bourne Legacy, and I thought Jeremy Renner was particularly fantastic in it. And here we have another sort of similar lone wolf role for him, though perhaps that comes out more in the subtext of the character as you hear about his job and history, as he is of course loosely partnered with Elizabeth Olsen's young FBI agent, as she herself delivers such a great, authentic performance. And so we polish off the trilogy with similar tones and themes to the other two, though this one is about a murder which Renner and Olsen's characters try to get to the bottom of. Similar to Sicario, it starts off with a dark and very impactful introduction, which again perfectly sets the tone for the rest of the film. It's another one that I would very much describe as unflinching. Similar to the landscape that the film is set in, it is harsh and gritty and unforgiving, dealing with more than a few very tough themes. However, you cannot help but to be absolutely captured by the story and the characters, which again just feels so real. And this is a rare one that has actually improved in my eyes since I first watched it. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely loved it the first time, but with this rewatch, it was even better than I remembered. And that more or less wraps up my thoughts on this breathtaking trilogy of films. As I put Sicario in to watch it, as it happens on very rare occasions for me when I get going with some amazing films, I ended up deciding to watch Hell or High Water right after that. And then of course one thing led to another, and I absorbed the whole trilogy in one incredible night of viewing. It's not something I often do, but every now and then it works brilliantly well, and it was amazing to see the incredible quality sustained throughout all three of these films. And then lastly onto the second trilogy, and it just occurs to me now that perhaps I should have made April a trilogy of trilogies, but oh well. Anyway, it's the exquisite Three Colours trilogy from Krzysztof Kieślowski. My pre-order of this wonderful 4K box set from Curzon arrived, and very shortly after I had a great time in revisiting these films. First up, and I think actually this time probably my favourite of the three, is Three Colours Blue. Here, Juliette Binoche gives an outstanding performance, and afterwards I actually looked it up and I was quite surprised to see that she wasn't nominated for an Oscar for this one, as watching her here is incredible. The way that she moves, her every gaze and expression, so much subtlety and rich, deep emotion in her every action is just wonderful to see. It's a film more or less about dealing with grief following a terrible accident, as we follow Binoche's character Julie as she battles with what she's going through. It's raw and rough, it's emotional and it's moving. Often with Kieślowski's films I think there are looser plots, and really the focus is on the people, the characters and their humanity. And Blue I think is a perfect example of this. Of course things happen to add texture and richness to the story, but really the focus is on the character of Julie, and each thing that happens is just helpful in showing the darkness, depression, emptiness, and struggle to face the reality and come to terms with what's happened, that the character herself is facing. This one certainly isn't a bad day cure to lift your spirits, but it is definitely a rich and rewarding watch. Next we have Three Colours White. I think most would regard it as the weakest of the three films, and I'd say it's more like a silver medal to the other two being gold, so of course still a brilliant watch. For me, during this particular rewatch, I felt it was perhaps a little bit rushed maybe, as it is only 92 minutes long, and I thought might have benefited from another 10 to 15 minutes. I think it definitely had the potential to be the equal of the other two, but the story just moves along a little bit too fast for it to really sink in and just mean that bit more to you. It starts off in fairly dramatic fashion as a Polish man, clearly down on his luck, living in France, is getting divorced by his French wife. The reasons for which are fairly humiliating for him, though I dare say there are some reasons that are left unsaid. And then really it's a story about a man who tries to become, in his eyes, worthy of a woman like his ex-wife, while also kind of working to deal her a humiliating blow such as was dealt to him. Our protagonist here is played by Jerzy Stuhr, and he is fantastic, and I also really liked him a lot in Kieślowski's Decalogue No. 10 as well. He really draws you in and carries the story on his shoulders. Julie Delpy is maybe not quite as good as she usually is in other films, though I can't really put my finger on why she didn't quite make the impact that I think the story needed here. This one could be described as a rags to riches story, but I would say it's a deeper one than usual, and certainly one that's full of Kieślowski's human condition explorations. You see the hardship, the heartbreak and the risks, but also the joy, the little victories and finally the payoff. It also has some of the perhaps hardest hitting moments in the whole trilogy, with some exceptionally moving scenes. It's also one where I can never quite make my mind up if I like the ending or not. It's undoubtedly an interesting choice, and I'd be curious to know what others think. And lastly, we have Three Colours Red, which was undoubtedly my favourite the first time I saw the trilogy, and I think I'd be right in saying probably a lot of people's favourite of the three. The story follows a young woman who accidentally runs over a runaway dog, who she then returns to its owner, a retired, somewhat unlikable judge, and we then see their relationship develop. I think at its core, this film is about two people bringing out something better in each other, and it's certainly the most positive of the three, which is perhaps why it resonates a bit more with most people than the other two. It sees the return of Irene Jacob to a Kieslowski film, having worked with him in The Double Life of Veronique just a few years prior. Her chemistry with Jean-Louis Trintignant is excellent, and together they really make the film come alive. As a chance meeting for two unlikely people, one in the early stages of their adult life and one in the latter stages, but both full of questions. The younger with questions of the future, and the older questioning his past. A wonderful last film to wrap up an incredible cinematic journey. This trilogy again is a much looser trilogy, though there is some crossover with characters if you keep your eyes peeled, and Red nicely wraps up each character's journey, albeit briefly at the end of the film. I will also just say briefly, as I rarely if ever comment on the picture quality, and I'm not too clued up on the technical aspects of the discs, but I did find the 4Ks a little bit disappointing. I do only have an LED TV, though it does have Dolby Vision, but honestly I'm not really too sure how much these films benefited from the 4K. Others of course might well have a different opinion, and there is no single ounce of regret that I bought these. This trilogy is a masterpiece, and I'm delighted to have them in the best quality they can be, and also for them to be presented in such a beautiful box set. And then to wrap things up, onto my list of honourable mentions, we start with two rewatches for me, the first being Jacques Audiard's Rust and Bone, which kicked off my buying of some plain archive releases, with masterful performances by both Marion Cotillard and Matthias Schoenaerts. And then probably my favourite film that I saw in 2021, though it actually came out a few years previously, One Cut of the Dead, which cheered me up no end, a truly joyous film, though it might not look like it at first glance of the cover. And then Claude Chabrol's The Colour of Lies. And how could I not mention Krzysztof Kieslowski's The Double Life of Veronique, which of course deserves a spot on my list, and could easily have been in the one above. And then lastly, Carol Zeman's wonderful Invention for Destruction, which I liked so much that I immediately bought the other two of his films in Second Run's catalogue. And at last, that's everything from me in my April in film. A very film heavy month for me, but a wonderful one. I hope yours was also a great month for movies, and I hope your May has been going excellently as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.